Hi, I'm Rob Cardona from World Racing. This is the installation video for our 2008 and up Scion XB Turbo Kit. Here's a list of the tools that you're going to need to get started. Here's a visual inventory of all the components that come inside the kit. We recommend that your turbo kit's installed by a professional. And if you're going to do it yourself, we recommend that you know exactly what you're doing and that all these components look familiar to you, because improper installation will result in complete failure of your vehicle. The first part of this installation starts with safely getting your car up off the ground. So whether you're using a lift or you're using a floor jack with jack stands, get the two front tires off the ground. At that point, pull the drain plug out of the oil pan so that you can drain all the oil out of the motor and disconnect your battery. At this time, it's also a good idea to drain the cooling system. The next thing you want to do is disconnect some of the sensors. So let's disconnect the mass airflow sensor and your front O2 sensor. In the next part, we're going to remove the factory exhaust manifold. You have to take off the factory heat shield and then remove the 12mm nuts that hold the factory exhaust manifold to the cylinder head of the vehicle. You'll also have to remove the mounts that are underneath the car and the spring bolts that hold it to the S-pipe. You need to remove your factory air intake tube and air box from the car. You're going to take the spring clamp off of the throttle body to remove the tube and then unbolt the factory air box. To do so, remove the bolts underneath the filter and disconnect the clamp at the inlet. Once you've removed the box, set it aside. Now from underneath the car, let's take the S-pipe off so that we can get the oil pan off the motor. Unplug the secondary O2 sensor from the factory engine harness and remove the two bolts that hold the S-pipe to the exhaust. Now that it's out of the way, you can access the 10mm bolts that hold the oil pan to the engine. To install the new oil pan, apply the Toyota liquid gasket to the pan rail and then bolt your new oil pan down to the engine. The last basic step to preparing your car for installation for the turbo kit is going to be removing your factory injectors. Remove the two bolts that hold your factory fuel rail down and pull the injectors up. Lube up your RC injectors and drop them into the fuel rail. Use the adapter harness to connect the injectors to your engine harness. Make sure when you install them that all 8 fuel rail injector O-rings are properly seated to avoid any leaks. Once the fuel rail is installed, use a mirror to make sure that all the O-rings are properly seated to avoid any leaks in the fuel system. Now we're going to install the oil feed adapter. We need to remove the factory oil pressure sensor, which also is going to be installed into this component. When installing this aluminum feed fitting, you've got to make sure of two things. A, you want to make sure you torque it down to the correct torque spec, which is 11 foot-pounds, and you want to make sure you put Teflon tape in the correct areas. You're going to apply Teflon tape to the male threads that go into the cylinder head, and you're going to apply them to the sensor when you put the sensor into the adapter. Torque the sensor adapter into the cylinder head at 11 foot-pounds, and then torque your sensor into the adapter at 11 foot-pounds. The first part of assembling your turbocharger is going to be installing these components right here. Identify the oil drain on your turbocharger and install the oil drain flange. Now we're going to install the oil feed fitting, which goes at the top of the turbocharger. Now install the vacuum port fitting. Next, loosen up all the compressor housing bolts so that you can easily align the turbo once it's inside the car. Use the smallest of the two V-band clamps included with the turbo kit to connect the turbocharger to the manifold. Once you've got your compressor housing lined up in the proper position, let's make sure that your oil drain and your oil feed are in the right position. Your oil drain is going to be pointing downwards and is going to point towards the oil pan, whereas your oil feed is going to be up here towards the top, pointing towards the manifold. The next step is going to be installing the wastegate. Your wastegate is going to come with some vacuum ports and some plugs that you have to make sure get installed correctly. First off, install the plugs. The plugs go 2 in the front and 1 on the top. The 2 vacuum ports go on the back side of the wastegate. Another part of your wastegate is the valve seal. This is the last piece that you install before putting it on the manifold. Install the wastegate to the manifold using the larger of the 2 V-band clamps. Seat the 2 components together and put down the clamp. This is what your manifold and turbo are going to look like once they're put together. Before installing them in the vehicle though, we're going to want to make sure that the compressor bolts on the turbocharger are still loose so that we can clock the housing when installing the intake pipes. Now we're ready to head back out to the car and begin the installation. To install the clutch line kit, remove the slave cylinder shield to expose the hard line. Unbolt the fluid dampener and remove the hard line from the transmission. Make sure to plug the temporary leak. Install both -3 AN compression fittings. These do not use Teflon tape. Now install the new -3 AN steel braided line. Your airbox bracket is installed by lining the hardware up with the holes on the bottom of the airbox. Once aligned, tighten the 3 bolts down to secure them together. Now bolt the airbox to the top of the transmission mount, drop the filter back in, and snap the box in place. To install the oil drain line, lube up the 45-degree -8 fitting and slide on the oil drain hose. Connect it to the bottom of the turbo. Now the manifold and turbo are ready for installation. When installing the turbo kit, you must relocate your lower radiator hose. Unclamp the spring clamp and pull the hose off the engine outlet. Next, you're going to remove the 2 10mm nuts from the OEM coolant neck and pull it off the block. Before installing the new coolant neck, apply some of the leftover Toyota gasket to the face of it. Now slide the coolant neck back on and bolt it up. At this point, you're ready to drop the manifold and turbo into the engine bay. Guide it in place and bolt it up to the cylinder head. Now you're ready to install the -4 AN oil feed line from the cylinder head to the turbo. Once the line is in place, tighten both of the -4 fittings. Once everything is tightened up, install your primary O2 sensor extension and connect it to the engine harness. From underneath the car, connect the oil return line to your new oil pan and tighten them together using the hose clamp. Now it's time to take off the front bumper. First, remove all the fasteners and hardware from the upper core support. Next, remove the fasteners and hardware from the side fenders and pull the bumper off. To install the intercooler, remove the bolts that hold the lower airbox breather tube to the car and pull everything through the fender opening. For clearance, unclip the wiring harness and get it out of the way. Now, using the bolts included with the intercooler, tighten it down to the chassis. From underneath the car, slide the first intercooler pipe into place. Use the 90-degree 2-inch coupler to connect the pipe from the turbo to the intercooler and tighten it down with the hose clamp. On the opposite end of that tube, use the 2.5-inch hump hose and connect it to the intercooler. To install the upper intercooler piping, use both straight silicone adapters. Connect the smaller one to the throttle body and the longer one to the end of the bottom of that tube, and then connect it to the second intercooler pipe. Connect the second intercooler pipe using the other hump hose and tighten it into place. Now use the 3-inch 90-degree adapter and connect it to the turbo outlet. Use the 3-inch straight adapter and connect it to the airbox. Now slide the intake in place. Use the 1-inch silicone adapters to install the blow-off valve to the intercooler piping. Also reattach the valve cover breather hose. Once all of these tubes are aligned, tighten everything down. Now slide the S-pipe under the frame rail and line it up with the down pipe. Use the gaskets and hardware provided to connect them to your exhaust system. Finish off your S-pipe install by plugging in your secondary O2 sensor. To install your engine harness adapter, unclip the factory ECU plugs and plug in the new engine harness adapter to the ECU and back into the engine harness. Now you want to run the AEM FIC harness through the firewall. Pull it from underneath the dash to the gauge cluster. Unscrew the gauge cluster and remove it from the dash. At this point, also pull a vacuum line through the firewall and plug it into the AEM FIC at the same time. Secure the FIC with Velcro behind the dash and put everything back in place. Now that you've got all the hardware installed on your vehicle, the last step of your installation is going to be syncing your AEM FIC to the actual vehicle. Although we send you the AEM preloaded with the base map on it, you still have to sync it to your actual car. So to do so, get back in the AEM box, refer to the AEM instructions, and go to Figure 31. Figure 31 is going to step-by-step teach you exactly what to do to sync it to your car. If you don't feel comfortable doing so, then the next step's taking it to the dyno, and the AEM authorized tuner that's going to tune this thing is going to obviously know exactly what to do. The turbo kit's installed, we've been to the dyno, so we know the car's safe to drive on the streets, so it's basically ready for delivery. And if you were picking your car up from us here at World Motorsports, the last couple of things that I would tell one of my customers is that you never want to run a car like this out of fuel, so quarter tank is now empty, and keep better maintenance on the car. Make sure that your oil level is always safe, And make sure that you change your oil more frequently because the turbocharger is going to break the oil down a lot quicker than it would have factory. Outside of that, enjoy your car and go have fun, but be safe.